So it is worth reminding ourselves of how lucky we are to be living in the most peaceful, most prosperous, most progressive era in human history. Now, that's hard to that's hard to absorb if we're watching the newscasts every night, because there's heartbreak and terrible things taking place at any given moment across the globe. But it's important for us to remember, not so that we become complacent, but so that we understand that good works can make a difference. We've saved over 60 million lives from measles and malaria and tuberculosis. We've slashed HIV/AIDS infections and deaths. Across the developing world, incomes have gone up. Tens of millions of boys and girls are in school. Millions have gained access to clean energy, helping to mitigate the threat of climate change. And sometimes when I'm talking to young interns at the White House who are still immunizing themselves from the cynicism that's so chronic in this town, I remind them, if you had to choose a moment in history to be born and you didn't know ahead of time who you were going to be, you'd choose now.
The epidemiologist Hans Rosling gave 1,000 people a series of multiple-choice questions on population, literacy, life expectancy, and poverty. He noted, if for each question I wrote the alternatives on bananas and asked chimpanzees in the zoo to pick the right answers, they'd have done better than the respondents. The reason was that the respondents consistently picked answers that were too pessimistic. I got the same result in a survey about violence in the present and the past, and this refutes the claim by Mr. Botton that the people's default position is one towards optimism. The facts are exactly the opposite. Ladies and gentlemen, you can do better than a chimpanzee. The cure for cognitive fallacies is data, and the trend lines are unequivocal. On average, people are living longer, healthier, richer, safer, freer, more literate, and more peaceful lives. While past performance is no guarantee of future returns, the world is not Wall Street. We are unlikely to wake up one morning and face a world with smallpox, slave auctions, or surgery without anesthetics. To be sure, the world faces formidable challenges, and that brings me to my final point. Optimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy, so is pessimism. The progress we enjoy is not the result of some mysterious historical dialectic, or law of inevitable progress, or arc bending toward justice. It is the result of people spotting problems, including nuclear proliferation and fragility, and instead of moaning that we're all doomed, applying their ingenuity and their efforts to solving them. A recent survey showed that people who believe that our way of life will end in a century also endorse the statement, the world's future looks grim, so we have to focus on looking after ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, don't be among them. It's irresponsible enough to be a fatalist when the objective indicators say the world is getting worse, all the more so when they say the world is getting better.
Nevertheless, the basic security environment that the United States created after World War II made it possible for the human race to move into a new kind of world order, a different world order than had existed in the past, and unique in some really critical ways. And I want to focus on three ways in particular in which the world order that America played such a big role in creating, how different this world order was. The first is simply a question, importantly, a question of economics. If you think about the period from the end of the Second World War to, let's say, 2000 roughly, but you can go beyond, it is a period of unprecedented prosperity in the history of mankind. Insofar as anyone can measure GDP, global GDP, through the millennia, and some people have tried. Angus Madison has tried as an economic historian to do this, you won't be surprised to know that throughout most of human history, average annual growth of global GDP was roughly zero. That mostly, the most of human history is about poverty, with a very few number of people living in some kind of wealth, but without generating any new wealth. That's most of human history. You know, you hear people like Steven Pinker, I guess he's an evolutionary biologist. Is that what he would call himself? In any case, you know, he wrote a book recently noting that the incidence of violent death among all human beings has been steadily declining. And what I find interesting about that is the date he picks to begin that study is 1945.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, Despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
So that is the order that we have been enjoying. I must say, I think we often take it for granted. I think we don't think very much about how special this period has been because we're naturally and understandably preoccupied with all the things that are wrong with it. I think this is true in our personal lives too. We're very aware of the things that are not going right and sometimes take for granted the things that are.
And so we're on this rising tide that's not recognized. It's overwhelming how prosperity is spread around the world. Say from 1960, where there were very few rich countries and a gigantic number of poor countries. Now most countries are middle-income countries, and poor countries are much smaller. Now, that just saying that they'll all move up past that threshold doesn't mean they won't have poor people within their countries, doesn't say their governance will be fantastic, but it will be a lot better on average than it is today.
In 1946, James Forrestal noted in his diary that the Soviets believed that the post-war world should be shaped by a handful of major powers acting alone. But he went on, the American point of view is that all nations professing a desire for peace and democracy should participate. And what ended up happening in the years since is something in between. The United States and our allies succeeded in constructing a broad international architecture of institutions and alliances, chiefly the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and NATO, that protected our interests, defended universal values, and benefited peoples and nations around the world. Then there's human rights and our support for democracy and the rule of law, levers of power and values we cannot afford to ignore. In the last century, the United States led the world in recognizing that universal rights exist and that governments are obligated to protect them. Now we have placed ourselves at the front lines of today's emerging battles, like the fight to defend the human rights of the LGBT communities around the world and religious minorities wherever and whoever they are. But it's not a coincidence that virtually every country that threatens regional and global peace is a place where human rights are in peril or the rule of law is weak. More specifically, places where women and girls are treated as second-class, marginal human beings. Just ask young Malala from Pakistan. Ask the women of northern Mali who live in fear and can no longer go to school. Ask the women of the eastern Congo who endure rape as a weapon of war. And that is the final lever that I want to highlight briefly, because the jury is in, the evidence is absolutely indisputable. If women and girls everywhere were treated as equal to men in rights, dignity, and opportunity, we would see political and economic progress everywhere. So this is not only a moral issue, which of course it is an economic issue and a security issue, and it is the unfinished business of the 21st century. It therefore must be central to U.S. foreign policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 13 years into the 21st century, and women have so much to celebrate, in the West, that is. Let's celebrate that in Australia, in America, in Europe, and the rest of the West, women are free and equal before the law. Let us celebrate that the birth of a girl is welcomed with as much ceremony as the birth of a boy. It wasn't always like that. It's not like that in most parts of the world, in fact. The education of a girl is obligatory in the West, and it's protected by law as much as that of a boy. That's worth celebrating. Institutions of higher education today court young women as much as they court young men. We take these things for granted, but they were not always there, and they are not there in most of the world. In human history, that's new. It is not the case in most of the world.